I happen to be very, very worried about humanity's survival with the early knowledge of climate change and global warming. And what I realized is that humans were not exactly unlike roaches in the sense that we were not going to die. We were not going to perish as a species. It became really clear to me that some portion of humanity would survive no matter what happened because of our creativity and our resilience. So the question becomes, what's the nature of that existence? Would it be harsh and crude and brutal, or would it be gorgeous and amazing and aesthetically pleasing? And there is a movement now, and I agree with it completely, that we can envision a brighter future, that technology got us into this mess, and technology is going to be what brings us out. So we're not going to solve the problem by planting more trees and by burning less fuel. We're going to solve the problem by finding better solutions that make life better and solve the problem. In a way, it's kind of as transformative as the shipping container, where, what used to take a week to unload the ship, you could unload that same volume in 5 minutes. What we're building is a replacement for generators, particularly diesel generators of the 25 to 50 kilowatt level. By flipping that paradigm on its head and creating a unit that will basically produce free power for the next 20 years, then it becomes a real question of what can we use these electrons for? In New Orleans, there's a real visceral understanding that climate change is happening and it is incumbent upon us to figure out more resilient ways to handle the storms, catastrophes, droughts, all the heat waves, all of those things that are hitting us.
Welcome to the Blue Economy Primer, a New Orleans-based podcast where you learn from the experts the practical tools and solution sets that will empower your community to adapt and thrive in a new blue era of rising seas and economic discontinuity.
Today we're speaking with a world-renowned sculptor and designer who has helped redefine the limits of large-scale kinetic art, both on Playa in the context of the Burning Man experience and through publicly accessible and interactive municipal art projects in cities around the world. Zach Coffin joins us in New Orleans from his home base in the San Francisco Bay Area. Zach is now developing cutting-edge renewable energy microgrid gensets that hold the promise of completely changing humanity's relationship to mobile generators, freeing us from the noise, pollution, and safety issues associated with diesel generators. Zach, thanks so much for joining us on the Blue Economy Primer. Can you introduce yourself to our audience, please?
Sure. I was born in Atlanta, and right after high school, I was lucky enough to become a newspaper photographer for a daily newspaper of law and business back in the era when newspapers actually still made money. And through that, I got a scholarship at the Cooper Union in New York City for the art school. I went to art school and started pursuing sculpture with a specific focus on kinetic work. And I started my early sort of complex relationship with gravity, exploring ways that sculpture could be sort of seemingly to defy gravity, take advantage of the strength of materials to try to change the way we think about gravity and materials and mass. During that process, I lived in a bunch of different places in New York, being a poor student, including living on a ferry, anchored ferry in the Hudson River. And I have some very distinct memories of pulling with just myself a giant boat with, and basically the difference was the friction was dropped to zero. And that informed a lot of my work in the future. Because I was at Cooper Union and enmeshed in the modern art world, the contemporary art world of the time, it was in the early 90s, and that was during the period where the art world, it seemed to me, was being taken over by this very superficial realm where art was basically becoming a method for money laundering, for very, very sophisticated money laundering. And it didn't seem like any particularly interesting intellectual ideas were being pursued, nor was there a particular interest in advancing craft. And during that time, I became quite disillusioned with the modern art, the contemporary art world of that time. I did, however, gain a year-long artist in residency at Socrates Sculpture Park in Long Island City, Queens, which was created and run by a pretty revolutionary artist, very, very well-known blue chip artist named Mark DeSuvero. And that was my first exposure to utilizing very large equipment and the possibilities of kinetic interactive art, where you place giant sculpture in a unsupervised setting, so that the people who weren't necessarily looking for an art experience would encounter and possibly have very dramatic and conceivably transformational experiences with art. So that led me on a whole path of seeking ways to build large-scale kinetic public art that was interactive and yet be safe. And this is extremely difficult, and it led me on a whole number of journeys. And in the process, I gained a lot of experience in machine work, welding, aspects of law, liability. I was basically created a set of work that was the lawyer's definition of an attractive nuisance. There was also a bunch of other things that I learned over a 30-year career of doing big public art about corrosion, wear and tear, galvanic corrosion, different materials, and that kind of thing. So all of this informs what I'm doing today.
So how did you get from New York City out to the Bay Area and then out into the Burning Man world?
Leaving New York, I basically fled the art world and decided that I was not going to be an artist, that I was going to focus on building quality objects, and moved to San Francisco during the early 90s. I think I moved there in 1993, maybe 1994, which is a really amazing and fertile time to be in San Francisco. And I started building. I started a shop with another fellow, and we were building all kinds of things, primarily for the Academy of Art College. During that time, one of the people that I was supervising insisted that we go out to Burning Man, and this was in 1996. So Burning Man was quite small, not very well known. I think the tickets were $65 or something like that. So I went out to Burning Man almost on a whim, and basically went through 3 days, which changed my life. One of the things that I recognized during that time, with crazy dancing and crazy parties in the middle of one of the most hostile environments on the planet, I happened to be very, very worried about humanity's survival with the early knowledge of climate change and global warming. And what I realized is that from that process is that humans were not exactly unlike roaches, in the sense that we were not going to die. We were not going to perish as a species. It became really clear to me that some portion of humanity would survive no matter what happened, because of our creativity and our resilience. But then, so the question becomes, what's the nature of that existence? Would it be harsh and crude and brutal, or would it be gorgeous and amazing and aesthetically pleasing? So that sort of reinvigorated my interest in art, because I realized that aesthetics were really critical, and inspiration was really critical for the human soul, for what we need as a species.
But you also have experience working in the Southeast, right?
So I basically picked up, and on a tip, I packed up all my stuff and moved to Birmingham, Alabama, right after Burning Man, because I found I got a tip that there was a large sculpture facility or a large sculpture space available for exhibition at the Birmingham Museum of Art, and there was a patron base there that was very interested in supporting the kind of industrial scale work that I was, starting to really pursue. So I went to Birmingham, Alabama, and did a show of 3 large pieces called Industrial Jungle, very well received solo show at the museum, and started selling about 1 large piece a year in Birmingham. Bought a house, and was, focused on building really large scale stuff. It was also in Birmingham that I started to really understand the nature of metallurgy, strength of materials, the possibilities of precision machine work, and the possibilities of kinetics. It was also in Birmingham that I built the first of my of what became a whole series of works called rock spinners, where I mounted a large rough boulder on a bearing at its exact center axis of balance, which would allow a 2-year-old to spin a 9,000 pound rock. And my thinking there was to completely transform the way we relate to our world, with the understand, like, everyone understands the weight of a large boulder, and if you go up to a big boulder, you are not going to be able to push it. But by mounting it on a precision bearing, it transformed that relationship through friction, and that harkens back to my experience in the Hudson River of pulling, a 30,000 pound boat by myself, right? Because the water drops friction almost to zero. So I was searching for a way to get something like that without having to, be on water or float a boat or that kind of thing.
Can you explain to us how your interest in renewable power generation evolved out of your initial sculpture work?
That was sort of the genesis of the work that I did for 30 years, and it led directly to the work that I'm doing now with the design for the solar generator. During that time, in order to keep my connection to the Bay Area, I kept going to Burning Man, so I would drive across the country and have that experience. And in 2000, almost as a joke, I proposed bringing a large rock to the event. The theme that year was the body, and I figured I would provide the kidney stone for the body, because they laid out the theory of the man flat on the ground, and Charlie Smith, another well-known Atlanta artist, did an anatomically correct heart. I just brought in a kidney stone, and Larry Harvey, the founder of the event, thought that was very funny, and then asked me if I would make it spin. So the next year, I built the first rock spinner out there at Burning Man, which was a 23,000 pound boulder that you could spin. It's pretty remarkable. So that sort of launched this whole career of big rocks moving, that I have continued to explore for some years.
So Temple of Gravity is 2003?
Yes, 2003. So I did the rock. I brought out a big rock, which I called the Sisyphus Project. And then I made that rock spin, in which case it was kind of, I left the rock out there in the desert. Then we moved it to a nearby ranch. And then I built a machine to lift the rock and mount it on a bearing, and shipped all that from Atlanta. And then on the Playa, we hung this huge rock and made it spin. It was an incredibly, it was a very difficult project, and taught me a lot about not doing work on the Playa if you can help it. So a lot of pre-planning, pre-design. I sort of ran out of rope in Birmingham, Alabama, and needed to make a change. So I moved back to Atlanta because I found there was a set of artists who had done a warehouse complex, and so I bought into that warehouse complex. And then the sort of the theme of the year in 2003 was faith. I think it was faith. Yeah, it was faith. And being somebody who does not come from the church and is pretty much looks at the world from a scientific perspective, I figured the only thing that I truly had faith in was gravity. And so I built a temple for gravity, which consisted of 5 pipes to make a big dome, 5 stones to anchor that dome at the bottom, and then 5 hanging slabs of granite that weighed anywhere from 15,000 to 17,000 pounds each. We actually fabricated everything, did all the stone work, the quarry work in Georgia, and then shipped everything out to Burning Man.
How did you manipulate pieces of rock that big once you were actually on site?
Burning Man had never had a piece of that kind of scale, and they didn't have the equipment to install it. So I opened the phone book. Back then, it was before the internet. I opened the phone book and found a crane operator in Reno who, unlike all the other crane guys, all the other guys were like, well, it'll be 8 hours minimum with, overtime and so on and so forth. And it was really clear that that would be cost prohibitive. And I finally found this guy named Richard Scott, who said, "Hey, pal, that sounds like a lot of fun." And so he came out with a 40-ton crane, which is way bigger than had ever been at Burning Man before, and we put together the piece, and it was to a large extent transformative for the art at Burning Man because it showed the possibilities of very large scale work, and it was work that was actually not sort of there were large things being built at Burning Man at the time, but they were all sort of in the sort of theater set sort of tradition, whereas lightweight, and it was it was all kind of a facade. And I wanted to deal with the real thing, the real object, and you can't fake mass. Mass is something you can't. There's no way that you can fake the feeling of interacting with a hanging 17,000-pound slab of stone. And the work was a smashing success. People still talk about it to this day because it really transformed the way they had thought about gravity, the way they had thought about art out at Burning Man. And it was a piece that matched the scale of the Playa. And scale is really important in a context of outdoor art.
So I'd like to ask you about how the containerization of Burning Man happened, but before we go there, could you give us a little bit of a background about the phenomena of the shipping container at a global scale and how that became such a ubiquitous tool for shipping, et cetera?
Because I was there at Burning Man really early, 1996, I think there were maybe 4,000 or 5,000 people out there that year, and it was a pretty pivotal year for Burning Man, and I also didn't think that it would survive, and lo and behold, it did. I watched Burning Man transform from a bunch of janky stuff on trucks that were brought out every year. And by logic, they started, it was inevitable that they started putting everything in containers and using large forklifts to just lift the whole container and put it on the Playa. So you didn't have to load and unload a truck, which is tremendously labor intensive. And containers have their own logic. And it matches what happened at Burning Man matches pretty closely what happened with the rest of the world with containerization. And the container phenomena happened. There's two really good books on it. One of them is 99% of Everything, and the other is The Box. And they're both really good histories about how the shipping container basically took over the world and transformed our civilization. And I could be wrong on the details, but I think it was in the 50s that a sort of maverick entrepreneur in New Jersey needed to figure out a way to ship more efficiently. I think he was running stuff down to Florida, maybe. And the costs for shipping were tremendously high back then because you had to hire union stevedores to unload ships by hand, and it would take days, if not weeks, to load and unload ships. And so he started experimenting with, first I think he did trucks. He would just pick the whole trailer and put them on, and then eventually he arrived, and I'm not sure the details, they're all in the books, but they arrived on the shipping container standard, which has now basically transformed industry and transformed the way we move goods around the planet in a way that we don't even see today, but it is utterly transformative economically and what it's made possible. And basically, they decided on an 8 by 20 foot, not metric, standard. And the main entrepreneur, one of the critical things that he did was that he did not patent that design, which basically released it to everyone and allowed it to become the international standard for shipping. And the ability to take 20 to 30,000 pounds of material, pack it into a metal box, and then move it from ship to train to truck in one move, taking minutes rather than days, was utterly transformative for the economics.
So how does that relate to the logistics of the Burning Man event?
So since I was going to Burning Man every year, and after as a little aside, the crane operator I hired for the Temple of Gravity turned around and started the heavy equipment division at Burning Man. and brought all of his expertise with large equipment and heavy equipment that frankly wasn't really available to the Burning Man community because they were all a bunch of anarchist partiers from San Francisco with no real heavy equipment experience. So he brought in a whole wealth of heavy equipment experience, and I watched as the organization transformed as it kept growing. The population was doubling every year, basically starting in 1996 until the tickets sold out sometime I'm not sure exactly when, but it was in the mid 2000s, I think. So I watched it grow into this gigantic organization, but they had all these logistical needs and a very narrow window of time to bring everything out to Playa because of the permit time was limited by the federal government. So they had to bring everything out in less than 2 weeks. So also as an aside, I became a crane operator for Burning Man, got my crane operator's license, and I continue to do that to this day, helping artists and camps build their work. It's a very rewarding and interesting work.
How many containers are we talking about?
I watched as Burning Man transformed, and without increasing the installation time of the city, the heavy equipment division started to bring out at least 1,000 shipping containers owned by the organization, and at least 1,000 shipping containers that were brought in by the participants. And so we were able to build a city of nearly 80,000 people in something like 7 to 8 days. Really remarkable, right?
Now, how does power generation come into play?
During that time also, the number of ICE generators, which is internal combustion engine, primarily diesel, but also gasoline, exploded. People went from living in tents and sort of camping out to full-on luxury, with air conditioners and all the accoutrements of an elaborate and orgiastic party, if you will. But as part of that generator, that explosion of generators, we had a huge increase in noise, a definite increase in sort of like fumes that you would smell walking by. That and the porta-johns became kind of a ubiquitous smell thing. And then what really bothered me was the heat island effect, and the fact that it was very noticeable in the nearly 30 years that I've gone to Burning Man, the increase in warmth. And some of that is probably due to global warming. As I looked around at my nomadic life, I realized that the only time that I was in one place on the planet at the same time every year was a Burning Man. And so during that time, I had a point of reference. And in the early years, it was always really cold at night. In fact, there were a series of years that I always showed up with heavy winter gear because of some of the cold. And now I barely bring a coat because it's just basically almost always warm, especially at night. And a big part of this is the generators. And also, as somebody who's aware of of the impact we're having on the planet, I felt very conflicted and troubled by the fact that, a bunch of, relatively wealthy, privileged white people were going out to the middle of nowhere, dragging thousands and thousands of gallons of fossil fuels out and basically burning it to air condition our tents. And it never felt right, especially when one of the biggest things that we were battling out there was the massive, incredible amount of solar radiation that was just coming down every single day. So combining all of those aspects, what you see is the possibilities of all those containers and the speed of deployment of containers. I started working on a design which would utilize the TEU envelope, which is 20-foot equivalent unit. It's a very strange acronym, but it is the standard. It's the industry standard term for a 20-foot shipping container. So I started designing a 20-foot shipping container that would have a set of unfoldable wings using basically the same technique and design as a scissor lift, but just making it project sideways. And started toying with the geometry of that and the deployment aspects of that. In the process of working on that design, I was invited to be one of the fellows at BlackRock Labs. And David Shearer, the founder of BlackRock Labs, which is the nonprofit sustainability arm of Burning Man, introduced me to Ryan Wartana, and we became business partners to develop this idea. Ryan had experience in solar and batteries, so we had a good skill match. And we started developing this prototype. As I started getting into it, I realized that I didn't have the engineering chops nor the ability to model the forces for the scissor properly. And doing giant cantilever beams is one of the most stressful things you can do to a beam. Cantilever is the toughest. So I recruited my good friend and boss at Burning Man, Andy Moore. We call him Bruiser. He's a mechanical engineer with decades of experience in heavy equipment in large, big cranes. And he stepped in and did all the FEA analysis on the scissor beams. And kind of amusingly, my first design, when we put it in the computer model and mapped the forces, the beams crumpled as if they were in aluminum foil. So we had to really beef up the scissors and it was a whole iterative process where we could make the scissors strong enough. And this is also, it was well matched because Andy has a lot of really practical experience, and particularly in cranes where the implications of failure are dire. Millions of dollars, lives lost, that kind of thing when there's a crane failure. So my sort of risk-taking behavior was an attitude towards that kind of thing was really mitigated by his very conservative understanding that we would have people hanging out, living, camping underneath these wings. So he required a certain safety factor that as time has gone by and as we've tested the unit in real world circumstances, I really appreciate that that conservative approach. And it also makes me very confident that these units will last 20, 30 years without any problem. As we started this, COVID hit. And I had, by chance, I had a stack of commissions with public art commissions. So, and COVID shut everything down. So I had the luxury of working the design using CAD and redesigning the design. And it took about 1.5 to 2 years to not only come up with a workable design, but to design the scissors so that they would resist the forces and be relatively simple to engineer, build, and to deploy. So that was a tremendous. It was an odd gift to have that time to work those things out because of COVID. Right about the time when Burning Man was starting back up, sort of at the end of the epidemic, we managed to use my studio at American Steel in Oakland to build our first prototype. And it was one of those times of magic where, unfortunately, American Steel was this remarkable artist community and I had been there for 10 years with my studio under a 10-ton bridge crane, good truck access and all that. But these real estate development jerks from Portland came, bought the building, and kicked everyone out. And there wasn't any negotiation possible. We were just told to leave. It just so happens that as everyone was leaving from my bay, which is large industrial bays under a 10-ton bridge crane, during that time, everyone around me started to move out. And so as we needed more space to build the first unit, more space became available. It was a building during a time of grace. It was kind of a remarkable thing to watch. So we built the first unit. It was a struggle. We were bootstrapping everything. We didn't have enough money. Everything is hard in the startup world. But the prototype worked, and it worked out of the box. It was kind of remarkable. The prototype, the first one we built was called Dragon Wings, and we took it out to Burning Man, and it worked. It worked flawlessly. There's some real key aspects to the design that are really important. One, the fast deployment. So you could pick it off a truck and you could move it within minutes with a large forklift or with a specialized side lifter machine for moving containers. And the machinery to move containers, TEUs, is ubiquitous worldwide. We can basically get a container nearly anywhere on the planet now. There is the resources to do that. So it was really important that it conformed to the shipping container standard. The other thing that became really important was that it had a zero footprint. And what I mean by that is that space is very valuable at Burning Man during the event in the city, right? Space is a premium. Like I've seen near fist fights break out over 8 inches of a property line between camps that, I would still be there 6 days later and it was a barren wasteland. So it was this very ephemeral value thing that happened. So I knew that if we had a large solar array, it would have real implications for the use of the ground. So by making this unit unsupported, so they're cantilevered wings, and then placing this unit on top of the existing 1,000 or 2,000 shipping containers that were out there, the effect was zero footprint. It had no effect on the real estate of the city itself. And the big bonus is you get a 90, 85 foot wings of shade. You got hard shade that was high in the air. So you could park under it. You could put your tents under it. Whatever you had, you could put under the shade. And shade is really important because the sun is so intense out there. And the other really critical thing is the storms come up very quickly without warning at Burning Man. The other thing that is different than a lot of other solar installations is that we gave it a brain. So with wind sensors and other ways of being aware of the environment around it. And so whenever the wind would kick up to a certain level, we designed it so it would automatically retract and self-protect in the wind. So it worked out to be a really good design, and some aspects that we didn't even consider in the beginning were really pretty remarkable. One of them was that by closing up automatically, the panels would go vertical, which would knock off any accumulated dust, which was always a huge problem for big solar arrays out at Burning Man. They would accumulate a lot of dust, and you would either have to go and wash them every day, or your solar generation would drop dramatically from that. So that was one aspect that was really good. And the other thing we discovered kind of in the middle of it is that if we closed it just about 10% in wind, it became much more rigid. So there was ways and it would still generate power, maybe not quite as much, but it would still generate power. So we went through that process, the whole startup thing, trying to raise money, trying to figure out how to manufacture to scale. All these things are actually really, really hard. It's like Elon Musk is no hero of mine, but he did say at one point, building a prototype is easy. Manufacturing at scale is really hard. And that is true, and that continues to be true. So we built another prototype, the parted ways as a business partnership. And I'm now in the New Orleans area working with some remarkable fellas to build the next generation design. I've completely redesigned it. I've given it more power, more storage, a lot of big advantages, lighter weight, easier to manufacture. All of these things are part of the next generation design.
So why come to Southeast Louisiana with this idea?
It seems to make a lot of sense to manufacture in the New Orleans area for a variety of reasons, but the critical ones are that there's not a very large venture, startup investment culture here, but it is here, and it's vibrant and it's enthusiastic, and they're also not dealing with the constant influx of pitches and ideas that the Bay Area is. Because so many people have made so much money in the Bay Area with apps and other things. There's a culture there of both constant pitching and also a culture of the venture capital there that really expects irrational returns that are not really, they work well for apps, but they don't really work. It doesn't work very well for manufacturing because manufacturing by its very nature is complicated and is a relatively low margin business, and there's just no real way around it. The other big thing in New Orleans is there's a real understanding, a real visceral understanding here that climate change is happening, it is upon us, and it is incumbent upon us to figure out more resilient ways to handle the oncoming climate storms, catastrophes, droughts, all the heat waves, all of those things that are hitting us. People in New Orleans know that stuff is coming in a really gut level way. So it seems to resonate. There's also a tremendous manufacturing base here, and there's a long history of energy being a really critical part of the economy. But there's also a recognition that energy is all oil, it's all fossil based, and it's going to cook us if we keep doing this thing. But, you have to have an economy in order to make any kind of changes. So all of that infrastructure, all that industrial infrastructure, a lot of industrial knowledge and tooling are here. And there's a real willingness to explore other ways of producing the energy and supporting the economy. And this design, it fits very well. It's not incredibly difficult to build, and it fits very well within the skill sets that are readily available here. So those things, along with this remarkable network that seems to be centered around the New Society and Tim Williamson, and the network that's formed around it with really good folks who are not only willing to take a little bit of risk, but really want to see New Orleans thrive and really want to see the economy transform to a sustainable one. So it feels like the culture is right. It feels like the industry is right. It feels like the costs are much better than California. It is much easier to manufacture at scale here. And then there's all this, both federal and state incentives to go green. And then there's a whole lot of sort of what would normally be called Republican businessmen who have recognized that green means green, as in greenbacks. And so there's a lot of enthusiasm and interest in what we're planning on doing. So it feels to me like it'll be possible to scale this technology in a way that would be not only be a thriving business and provide a lot of jobs for the economy, but has the potential to transform the energy sector and really set this area on a much more sustainable path.
So I want to remind our listeners that we'll have lots of links available to some of the references that Zach is talking about, including those books and, of course, his website where you can see some of this amazing artwork that he's done, these large-scale sculptures. So, Zach, you've talked about how climate change is palpable around the world and particularly affecting this region. How do you see the use of solution sets like the SolarWing growing and changing the way people use energy?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, understand that what we're building is a replacement for generators, particularly diesel generators of the 25 to 50 kilowatt level. And generators, there's really no mobile solution to replace generators out there now. And generators are loud, smelly, expensive. They are contributing directly to the global warming. And you have to provide fuel, a constant amount of fuel. So by flipping that paradigm on its head and creating a unit that will basically produce free power for the next 20 years, then it becomes a real question of what can we use these electrons for? On a sunny day, we're going to average between 150 and 180 kilowatt hours a day of generation. And we can store a lot of it in batteries. And we're able to leverage the EV industry batteries to the EV industry is really bringing down the cost of batteries so that we can do a lot of storage. We can easily do 2 to 3 days of generation storage in these units. So then you have a situation where you can replace a generator in any situation. But unlike a generator, which costs between 60 cents and 80 cents a kilowatt hour for power, you've got a situation where you're making power every day for $0, for marginal costs. It's just the capital cost of the unit. So there's all kinds of situations where we can find a use for electrons that in a way it's kind of as transformative as the shipping container, where what used to take a week to unload the ship, you could unload that same volume in 5 minutes. We've got a same sort of paradigm shift in the sense that once you have this unit, you have 150 to 180 kilowatt hours of power to use for whatever you want with no marginal cost. And the next day you'll have that same amount of power again, right? So there's applications that are just kind of open to the imagination, right? Everything from one idea that I've had is you have a set of autonomous drones, a SolarWing on a truck, and a tank of water. You get it, you deploy it as close as you can to a newly emergent forest fire, and then you have a swarm of drones charging with the SolarWing, picking up a gallon of water, and then using infrared technology to find the hottest spot on the fire and drop just a gallon of water. But because you're not using human pilots, you don't have to worry about the safety factor and keeping clearance between the flying vehicles, right? So you can essentially use a drone swarm to put out fires very quickly, with much less use of resources and energy and capital equipment than our current paradigm. And that's just one thing, one area. You could use it in farming. A lot of vegetables and fruits are lost to rot in the fields. You could power a refrigerated container so that and you could move it with the harvest so that farm workers could immediately put the fruits and vegetables into refrigerated containers and reduce loss. At the same time, you could have that unit travel with the harvesters and provide shade for them, cooling for them, and atmospheric. You could harvest water, atmospheric water for potable water. So there's all these solutions that we haven't even thought about because the cost of energy was too high, right? By pushing the marginal cost of power to close to zero, opportunities show up all over the place. Now, of course, there's also disaster relief. You've got the ability to have power without the supply chain problems of diesel. I mean, every time you hear about a major storm, everything gets all messed up. It's a disaster. 3 days later, sunny skies, beautiful weather, it's clear, but there's no power, and they can't get diesel to the generators. And after the first couple days of fuel run out, suddenly everyone has these, a generator without fuel is about as useful as it's more useful as a boat anchor than anything else, right? It has no particular value. We don't have that problem. We don't have that. So pre-staging these before major weather events, so that you could set up cooling stations. Once again, atmospheric water harvesting is a real possibility. There's basically no situation where humans can't improve life with more electrons. Like we can continuously find new uses for electrons if we have them and they're not too expensive. One big issue that's coming up and that's blocking the way of the adoption of EV electric vehicles everywhere is range anxiety. And the problem is that we are not able to provide enough charging stations in enough places so that people feel comfortable taking their EVs to distant areas or places off of the beaten path. And if you look at the costs and time frame to install charging stations, not only does it take a lot of engineering and a lot of geotech stuff, and every installation is kind of the same, requires the same amount of engineering, unique permitting. Every jurisdiction has their own permitting process, own building department process, so on and such forth. We can flip that whole paradigm on its head by showing up with a SolarWing with an EV charger and deploy in 5 minutes. Right? So if you're at national parks, you don't want to drive a long way to a national park with an EV and then not be able to drive home and put yourself in a position where your EV is dead. You've been hiking and you have to hike out, whatever. So we could put these all different kinds of places and charge EVs with no marginal fuel costs at all. And that could really hasten the deployment of EV all over. So that's just one application, and the possibilities are kind of endless. Cell phone towers all have backup generators because they need their critical infrastructure and they need to stay up 24/7. Well, if there's a power outage situation, or like what's happening in California, where in high wind, dry situations, they just cut the grid off because they can't have the power lines drop into and start fires, right? So they just shut off the power. Well, cell phones, towers need to stay up and running. Grocery stores need to keep their freezers freezing, otherwise, millions of dollars worth of food is lost. There's all these situations where, all of these systems, there's no option for them other than backup diesel generators with all their problems. Well, we could be a replacement for all different kinds of situations. So it's kind of endless. The question always comes down to what is the capital cost of the equipment and whether we can bring the cost down low enough to make it a real practical solution. And that requires manufacturing to scale. So that's really what we're focused on now.
Wow, Zach, thanks so much for sharing some of these ideas. Is there anything else that we haven't had a chance to talk about that you'd like to touch on?
Well, I would say that, I guess I kind of grew up during a period of doom and gloom about the future and about how global warming is going to end humanity. And I think there is a movement now, and I agree with it completely, that we can envision a brighter future. That technology got us into this mess, and technology is going to be what brings us out. So we're not going to solve the problem by planting more trees and by burning less fuel, because humans are just not going to do that. We're going to solve the problem by finding better solutions that make life better and solve the problem. And I think that it really behooves us to think positive and recognize that life can be better and that we can use these phenomenal tools and these phenomenal technologies. I mean, just in the last 10 years, the price of solar panels has dropped, I don't know, what is it, like 100-fold? I mean, it's one of the greatest things in human history in terms of economics is both the price of solar voltaic electrons, and then on the flip side, the widespread adoption of LEDs for lighting. It's one of the greatest economic transformations in history, and that's only happened in the last 10 years. So if we embrace the future and envision a better, more positive future for humanity, where it's not one of scarcity, but it's one of figuring out ways to help humanity advance and grow and change without the kind of scarcity and suffering that is so often part of the conversation when we discuss global warming and climate change and so on. Yes, it's going to be painful, and there's going to be some really, really gnarly storms and some really catastrophic events. But I do think that if we embrace the future and embrace the technologies that are just now coming online and really practical at scale, we can have a much brighter future and a better world for our children than the ones that are kind of the sort of the current paradigm is saying. And it doesn't mean we should be lackadaisical or Pollyannish and just sit on our heels and assume that everything will be fine. We're going to have to work at this, but it is possible. And the new technologies that are coming online right now with batteries, PV, and all the other like hyper efficient things like the new heat pumps and other aspects are really bringing that technology within grasp for us now.
Well, Zach, that certainly sounds like a great vision for the future that we'd like to be a part of. Thank you so much again for being on the podcast. We certainly look forward to staying in touch and supporting what you're working on and seeing what comes of SolarWing in the coming months.
Right. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for joining us on the Blue Economy Primer. If you enjoyed today's podcast, don't forget to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. Please help us spread the word, and be sure to visit our website at www.deepblue.academy, where you can find all of our available episodes, access important links and supporting information for each episode, send us your comments and/or suggestions for potential guests and topics, get more information about our community engagement initiatives, and join our mailing list, as well as make a much appreciated tax-deductible donation to support our nonprofit education and research mission. Thanks again to the Dan Lucas Memorial Foundation and the Pontchartrain Conservancy for their critical financial and institutional support. Until next time, when we meet again on the ever-expanding horizon of the blue economy.